My name is Chris Konichka, and I'm a local food and small farm educator with the University of Illinois Extension, working in Livingston, McLean, and Woodford counties here in central Illinois. I'm based in the Bloomington area office. I'm joined today by Jeff Kinehart, who I'll allow to introduce himself in just a moment. Today we're talking about transplants, and the name of our program is called Transplant Success. We're trying to walk you through the basics, A to Z, from purchasing a seed, making sure it's viable, getting it into a plug tray, taking care of all the environmental factors to make it work, and then deciding how and where and when you'll plant it out into the field, which will get you a harvest of your chosen crop and hopefully a profit from that in the end. Here at Extension, we have a lot of great resources, information that's directed at small farmers, and we really are looking for ways to get in touch with people to share this information. So if you guys have ideas after the presentation, feel free to share them with me, and there'll be some good time for questions as well with regards to transplants. The first section is going to be covered by Jeff. He is in the Ag Center down at Dixon Springs, part of the University of Illinois as well. And right now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff and let him get us started. Take it away, Jeff.
Okay. As Chris said, we're going to talk about transplants today. And I think if you look, historically, 20 years ago when we had lots of large vegetable farms, we oftentimes bought our transplants and had them shipped in, typically from Mobley, Florida. And most growers are no longer doing that, and I think as we've seen an increase in the utilization of high tunnels, it's become even more commonplace for growers to raise their own transplants, likely because the timing becomes quite a bit different since we're trying to set the tomato plants a month earlier in the high tunnel than we're wanting our transplants a month earlier, and most of the normal greenhouses don't have anything programmed to come off at that time, and so we're seeing more and more producers raising their own transplants, sometimes successfully, sometimes not. I'm going to start this off with, and I certainly don't want to bore you with the botany lecture to any great extent, but do bear in mind we're starting with a seed, which hopefully should be a living organism, and there are typically two kinds of seeds, dicots and monocots. Although there are very few monocots that are transplants, most of the stuff that we're going to be working with are dicots. And if you look at the left-hand side here, that white section that says seed germination, on the right hand of that slide is a picture of a corn, which is a monocot, corn plant germinating. And again, there are a few producers that raise sweet corn as a transplant, but it is not very commonplace. Most of us are going to be looking at raising things like tomatoes or peppers or cucurbits, melons, pumpkins, gourds, those kinds of things, and those are dicots. And I point that out just for the following reason. If you look on the upper left-hand side, it shows what you would think of for a soybean or a green bean germinating, where the cotyledons actually come up out of the ground attached to the stem. Tomatoes behave the same way. That's called epigeous germination. There are a few things like peas you see in the bottom left that have hypogeous germination, where the cotyledon stays underground. The only reason that's important, if you look at the bottom right, there's a tomato transplant that got messed up because when the cotyledons came up, if you look at the upper right, you can see how the seed coat is still attached to the two cotyledons, and you'll see this a lot on tomatoes and pumpkins and seedless melons. And if that hangs on there, you can wind up having a seed that gets messed up. So I just wanted to point out it's a good idea to periodically walk along, and you can just kind of pick at those and get them off of your transplant. Okay, we're going to have to start this operation of transplant production by getting seeds to germinate. What are the factors required for seed germination? First of all, we have to have viable seed. You can plant all the dead seed in the world and you're never going to get a good transplant. You're not going to get a plant. We have to have the correct environmental conditions, and though there are really five, the four that we worry about are water, temperature, oxygen, and light, and we'll go over those as we go through the presentation. And we also have to worry about the seed being free from dormancy. And although that's not a problem when you purchase seed, there are probably a few of you out there that are going to do some seed saving And in some cases, when we save seed, we have to make sure that whatever is required, whether that's a stratification period where we have to put them in peat moss and keep them in the refrigerator for 2 or 3 months, whatever it takes to break dormancy, we have to make sure that we do that if we're saving our own seed. If you're purchasing seed, typically the dormancy problem has already been an issue, has already been addressed, before you ever receive the seed in your UPS shipment. The other thing, for those of you that are going to collect your own seed, and Chris is going to talk about this later, but make sure we store seed, whether it's seed that we have saved out of the garden for ourselves, or whether it's leftover seed from this year that we're wanting to use next year. But make sure that you have it at the correct temperature, relative humidity, and seed moisture. And again, that's going to be covered in more detail later in the talk. If you store seed properly, this is sort of a chart, like sweet corn, for example. Once sweet corn gets to be 2 years old, it really decreases in its percent germination, and you would like to only get the amount of sweet corn each year that you're going to wind up consuming in that year. For excuse me, for some other crops like tomatoes, that seed may be viable for 5, 6, 7 years. 5 years should be pretty safe. Peppers, 3 or 4 years is pretty safe. But bear in mind that the seed viability longevity, how long that seed stays viable, is a function of not just storage conditions, but also individual species. Some things just live longer than others, or the seed remains viable for a longer period of time than others. So if you wind up saving seed, which you will wind up doing, when you go digging through your seed cabinet or your shoebox where you keep all your seeds, if you're trying to plant 4-year-old sweet corn seed, you're just not going to have very great success. Okay, so we said we were going to talk about germinating a seed. We've talked about having a viable live seed to deal with. The next thing on the list was providing a good environment, and the most important, or I think the most common downfall for people trying to raise transplants, is failing to provide proper temperature for seeds to germinate. This is just a chart that shows an example of, you take any individual species that you're trying to produce. If you look, there's some optimum temperature at which not only do you get the greatest percent germination, but in addition to that, if you look, you get not only the greatest percent germination, which is represented by the green line, but you also get the fewest number of days to emergence. So we get the most seed up in the most narrow window. And that's important for some reasons we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Here's a chart, and I am sure this is something else that would be great if we could blow it up. If you look at something like tomatoes, for example, which I understand is hard to see on your screen, but at 77 degrees you get 97% germination, and that tomato seed germinates in 6 days, as opposed to a lot of times if we're germinating in a greenhouse, it's probably going to be getting pretty cool at night, and at 55 degrees you still may get 90-some% germination, but it's going to take 14 days to get all of that seed to germinate. And the problem is this: in that 14-day period, some of those seedlings are going to wind up being too big for transplanting. We would like them to come out over a very short period of time so that everything can be programmed in the greenhouse. We don't want this spread out across 2 or 3 weeks. We would like all that seed to come up in 2 or 3 days rather than 2 or 3 weeks. And so that's one of the reasons why having the correct temperature, and again it varies from species to species, is so important. Okay, so we talked about temperature. Next on the list, we want to talk about water and oxygen. And water and oxygen are going to be a function of the media, or the mix that you're going to be placing these seeds in. And I put these up here just to show you. Here's some examples of different kinds of media that can be used for starting seed. And ProMix makes something called plug mix. It is in fact different than ProMix that's used for growing the plants. It's a finer material. It doesn't tend to hold quite as much water. It creates a better environment. If you're a smaller operation, you can go to garden centers and get seed starting media, and seed starting media is different than trying to start in potting soil. And potting soil tends to, again, be too wet, and it causes not only health issues for the seedlings, but a lot of times it'll keep them from growing at all. A couple of other examples that you see here on the far right, which those are Jiffy peat pellets. Those are going to be most commonly used for plants that do not respond very well to having their root system disturbed. We would see growers raise mostly cucurbits, things like pumpkins or watermelons or squash. Those can be raised quite nicely in these peat pellets. In the bottom right, you're seeing something called Groden blocks, and those are useful for growers that are going to take their resulting transplants and continue to grow them out in a hydroponic situation, and it keeps you from having media in your hydroponic system that you're utilizing to grow the plants. These Groden blocks are, I don't know, they're not quite like styrofoam, but they're sort of like styrofoam, and you know, there's no peat moss or any of those kinds of components to it. So if you put them in a hydroponic system, you don't have anything messing up your water. We said light can be an important factor, and in the vegetable transplant world, light is probably only important for lettuce. If you bury lettuce seed, your percent germination is going to be very poor. You know, lettuce needs to be sown basically on top of the flat. If it doesn't have access to light, in many cases it will not result in germinating. But I do want to point out, if any of you are raising bedding plants, there are a number of ornamental crops that have got to have, the seed has to be exposed to light in order to germinate properly. And so when we seed those crops, we seed them on top of the media, and we don't cover them, or if we do cover the seed, we cover it only very, very lightly. Okay, so we've got viable seed, and we've gotten to the point now where it's time for us to do some seeding. What ways can we, how can we deal with this seed? Well, you can broadcast it across the top of, for example, a flat. You can sow it in rows, either in an individual flat or in a seedling tray, or you may direct seed into a plug tray or a Jiffy pellet or a Groden block like we looked at previously. Here's an example where you just take seed and broadcast it uniformly across the surface of something, typically a flat filled with seed starting media. This is a technique probably most commonly used for fine seeds, which in the world of vegetables, onions would be real fine. In the ornamental world, I think begonia seed is the classic example. Begonia seed is so fine that it looks about like dust, to be honest about it. And so oftentimes we would actually take the seed and cut it with sand and then sprinkle that resulting sand seed mixture across the flat so that we could get the seed spread out a little more uniformly. The problem with broadcasting seeds on a flat, and again, Chris is going to talk about damping off later in this program, but damping off is a fungal disease, and if you'll look in the right-hand picture, you can see where damping off has started in two different sections of this flat, and if you have the seed broadcast uniformly across a flat, that disease will walk all the way across the flat and kill all the seedlings that are in the flat. If you have things sown in rows, then we tend to find that the water mold or the organisms that cause this damping off wind up spending most of their time contained in consuming just a row as opposed to losing an entire flat of resultant seedlings. Here's an example of a seedling flat, and again, you can take a regular 10-20 flat and sow things in rows, but the nice thing, this just tend to keep, if you're growing a lot of different varieties of plant material, they do a much better job of making sure every individual cultivar stays segregated one from another. Seedling flats are very, very cheap, very much reusable, and they're a great choice, and we see lots of smaller growers utilizing this particular, these seedling flats filled with plug mix, sow our seeds in them, and then germinate them. They do make a variety of tools to try to spread out seed. You can see here, 5 different kinds. I have used all of these kinds, and my personal preference, I just as soon sling them out of the packet into those trays as anything else. But all these devices do exist, and like the trowel looking one on the far right. It's got a little clicker on it, and as you roll your thumb across that clicker, it winds up sort of vibrating or sonicating the seed to try to get them so that when you set them in their row, they're a little more singulated, which makes it easier. In just a minute, we'll talking about transplanting them, and it makes it easier to do and just, easier to transplant them if you have them singulated out as opposed to being a big blob in one spot. Okay, so we talked about broadcasting the seed across the flat, and we talked about sowing the seed in rows. A third choice that exists is to directly seed. Probably most commonly it's done into a plug tray, and these are examples of plug trays that you see here. And the difference, if you look, it says there that the top left hand shows a 128 tray on the bottom and a 512 tray on top. What that 128 or 512 refers to is the number of individual cells or the number of plants that can be held in that individual flat. Plug trays are very common in large operations. They tend to be a little bit less common in smaller operations because you typically have to have some specialized equipment to successfully get the seed singulated so that you're only dropping one seed in each and every hole. But if you are a smaller grower, definitely there are affordable options. In the top right-hand picture, you're looking at a seeder made to seed plug trays that's made out of conduit. You flip it back and forth, and it's got dibbles in it, and it just or dimples in it, I'm sorry, and it drops one seed at a time, and then you advance the flat one row, and you go again. In the bottom right, you're looking at a single row vacuum needle seeder. There's a little vacuum pump attached to this, and there's small needles that you can see on the insert in the picture at the bottom right. And you hold that over a tray containing lots of seed. You turn the vacuum on. Each needle will acquire an individual seed. You then hold it over the top of the next row to be seeded. You turn off the vacuum supply, and the seeds drop onto the corresponding cells that they belong in. On the bottom left is sort of that same system as at the right. That's a Blackmore needle seeder on the bottom left. And in this case, the moving of the seed, turning off and on the vacuum, and the advancement of the flat is all done mechanically. So you start a tray through it at one end, and it will automatically advance it one cell at a time, and the needles will flip over, pick up seed, turn all the way around, drop the seed on the tray, go back up, and it will advance the plug tray one row, and it will continue to do that until there is no longer fresh cells to be filled. As soon as there's not a tray to be there, this system, it cycles, but it doesn't actually pick up any seed until you re-put another plug tray in place and start the system again. The bottom left works absolutely fantastic, but it is several thousands of dollars for one of those, and probably not something that is very practical for someone getting started or someone who has a smaller operation. Here's another method that we do see some of in smaller operations. In this case, we've got a vacuum. If you look at the top left, there's a hose in her right hand. That is basically, it's going to a shop vac. And that is a plastic tray that you see, and there's seed. You can see the pink seed on top of it. You swirl the seed around on top, and there are holes punched in, and those holes correspond with whatever tray you're using. If it's a 512 tray, then there's 512 holes in that piece of plastic. You rake the seed across with the vacuum cleaner turned on, and each hole will accumulate a seed. You dump the excess seed back in a tray. You turn it over, as you see in the bottom of the picture. Once you get it lined up with the flat, you turn off the vacuum cleaner. All the seeds drop off into their individual holes where they belong. You turn around, flip it back over, and start the cycle again. So in this particular case, you seed an entire flat with one single operation or one single turn of that device. These are relatively common in larger small operations or in medium-sized operations. Okay, and here's the resulting, this is kind of what a plug tray looks like if you've not seen a plug tray before, but what they look like. Lastly, we want to talk about direct seeding, and Here's a case where they're showing you, and strangely enough, this is a Jiffy advertisement. I would probably pay somebody a small amount of money if you could actually pull this trick off. I'd like to see you make a transplant that looks like number 3 using a Jiffy peat pellet that you seeded, but I do think they're very, very good for use with, again, things like pumpkins or gourds or melons that really don't take transplanting very well. Because you're going to plant that entire Jiffy pellet as one unit, you're not going to disturb the root system, and the plants tend to grow off quite well. But there's an example where you're going to direct seed, but in that case you're going to direct seed by hand. Okay, we've got our plug tray or our seed flat or whatever we're going to use loaded up with seed, and it's now time to think about germinating it. We said earlier we needed warm temperatures to germinate, and if you'll look in the top left, there's what a very, very small grower would use. That's a mat that is plugged into electricity, and it heats up. It's like a heating pad when you've got an earache or something that you'd use at home. And that heating pad will get warm and keep the seeds warm. That's for a really small operation. In the bottom right is for a large, medium-sized operation. That's a germination chamber where typically you have not only heat, but oftentimes you also have a source of humidity so that everything stays nice and moist. There'll be a little humidifier in there. On very large operations, the greenhouse that I worked at for a couple of years, we actually had a walk-in cooler that was converted into a germinator, and it was, very large in size, but we did, when we went and seeded verbena, we might do 150 plug trays of verbena in a single day, and so it was a much larger operation than what most people would have. This is a more common for medium-sized operations. What you're seeing here, if you look at the bottom right-hand picture, it shows it best. Those pink mats that you're seeing underneath of the flats, the plug trays, those pink mats, they're really hog farrowing mats, but we use them a lot in the horticulture industry. And they're used for, again, it's kind of like the heating pad when you have an earache at home, only it is much larger in size, number one. Number two, it's very durable. Again, they were made for farrowing pigs to get up on. It's very durable and very waterproof. They do eventually wear out, though, and if you look at the back, and again, in the bottom right picture, if you look at the back, you'll see a shiny silver blue material laying on top of that hog farrowing mat, and those are what new style, these things are called propagation mats, but what new style propagation mats look like. Very effective tools, and the way that they're utilized, yeah, that's a fact. Make sure the heat mat is grounded properly, and because it is a 110, it's not a low voltage operation. The way these things are utilized, if you look in the right hand side of this picture, this is a thermostat, and you plug this particular box, the cord coming out of this blue box gets plugged into the wall. Your heat mat gets plugged into this blue box. There is a big copper colored thermostat. That copper colored thermostat is set in one flat that is filled with the same media as you're utilizing to grow your seeds in, and it's watered the exact same way, so it has the same moisture content. That thermostat is now adjustable. If you look at the blue box in the center, there's a knob on there, and you get a soil thermometer like you see in the bottom left and place it in an individual tray, and you adjust the thermostat until you obtain the temperature that allows for optimum germination of whatever particular species that you're using. Another thing that used to be fairly common, but is less common now, in the upper left you're seeing heating cables, and heating cables can be placed underneath the flats and also plugged into the same thermostat that's shown in this picture and utilized to create the proper environment for good seed germination. As soon as the seeds start to germinate in your tray, whether it's a plug tray or a flat that you have seeded, it's pretty important that you get them out of that 80-some degree environment. Typically it's not in full sunlight where we germinate the plants, and get them moved out to the greenhouse. If you delay moving them out to the greenhouse, your seedlings will stretch and become very, very difficult to move. Your resulting transplant 4 weeks down the road will be of much poorer quality. What we're shooting for is keeping a nice, short, thick transplant is what we're looking for. And the first step in doing that is as soon as the seeds start to germinate, you need to get them moved out to a greenhouse where you're running 70-degree temperatures, not 80-degree temperatures, and you're at full sunlight. Okay, we've got our seeds germinated. You know, we got our seed, we bought it, it's viable. We put it in the right temperature. We put it in the correct media. We sowed it in a plug tray or a seedling flat, and we have gotten our resulting transplant. They germinated. We waited about 7 days, and now it's time to pot them. Before we can pot them, though, we've got to decide what kind of material we're going to use. The most common materials used are plastic, clay, and peat, and we also need to consider size. And part of the thing, you know, whatever size you're going to grow, it needs to be large enough to support whatever your finished transplant size is going to be. But secondly, do bear in mind that for some crops like tomatoes, the larger the transplant, the earlier we will have marketable fruit produced. So if we take a tomato transplant that is from a 2-inch pot versus a 4-inch pot, that transplant that was grown in the 4-inch pot will have earlier yields, and that is important for many producers. Material, we look at typically plastic, clay, or peat, and we can look at those real quick. Plastic is the most economical of the materials. It's very lightweight. It can be reused in many cases, although we need to practice good sanitation and make sure that we use bleach water to sterilize from one crop to the next. And then plastic will come in a nearly infinite selection of sizes. The downfall with plastic, in my humble opinion as a person that's grown plants for a long time, the downfall with plastic is that it tends to stay too wet, and it's difficult to create the absolute best environment to raise the very best transplant that you can. If you're going to grow good transplants, we need to grow them dry. Here are some examples of flats. If you look at the top, that's called a 10-20 flat. It's called a 10-20 flat because it's 10 inches in one direction and 20 inches in the other. That's why we call it a 10-20 flat. And if you look, we typically put some kind of insert in that. If you look, there are 8 individual packs, and in each individual pack there are 6 holes, and so that's called an 806 insert. And the inserts come in a variety of choices. On the right, you're looking at round geranium pots. We like to use those round geranium carrying trays, but we tend to grow here in, we grow our tomato plants in peat pots, but we do use those geranium carrying trays to keep them on the bench in. Clay is a material that was used commonplace in the past. It's great to grow in. Very forgiving, particularly, you know, most people when they're starting out want to water way too much, and clay tends to be very dry, and so it helps new growers by making it more difficult for them to keep things overwatered and too wet. Clay is reusable, but clay is, 1, expensive, and 2, it's very, very heavy. Every time you go to move it, whether it's in season or in off season when you're having to clean out the greenhouse, it's heavy and cumbersome to handle clay. Works great, but has largely fallen out of vogue as we've had an increase in popularity with these compressed peat pots that can be purchased. And compressed peat pots originally tended to be single individual pots like you see on the left. And again, you know, I love growing tomato transplants in 4-inch round peat pots. It works absolutely wonderfully. When I worked at a farm where we raised 30 acres of state tomatoes, we grew, like you see in the bottom right, we grew all of our tomato transplants in 3-inch square pots. And if you look, instead of being single pots, they come already kind of stuck together so that it's much less work to fill the tray, and they work very well. They're not quite as easy as plastic to handle, but when they're stuck together, the process does go pretty quick. Again, I worked in an operation where we had 25 acres worth of tomato plants, and we grew all of them in that kind of a pot. Okay, we've decided on what kind of pot. Now we have to decide on what kind of media. And again, I don't think I can say this enough, so I'm going to say it one more time. There is a difference between plug mix that you're going to germinate your seed in and growing media that you're going to use after the seedling has emerged and you're going to grow out the transplant. Growing media, there are many kinds. Fafford, Metro Mix. I think one of the most common and most widely used in the industry is stuff called Pro Mix, And so, that's what I'm not endorsed by them. They don't give me anything free. I don't care what kind of media you use. ProMix is one, though, that is fairly widely used. If you look, here's kind of the resulting, this is a picture showing transplants grown in a variety of different media. On the far left is just straight perlite, and if you look, the transplants are very small. It's hard to keep it wet enough. On the far right is straight cocoa fiber, which tends to be really, really heavy and stay really, really wet. The plant on the right looks good, but if we were to look at that resulting transplant about 2 weeks from now, you would find that it's stretched out. The transplant in the middle is one that, the third row from the left, is grown in ProMix, and it's a nice combination of being not too wet or not too dry. It has a good ratio of bulk density and airspace and all the things that are important for growing the plant. When we look at ProMix or whatever modern soil that you're going to use in a greenhouse, I need you to bear in mind that these are almost always peat-based growing media. What you're seeing here is the label for the technical specifications for ProMix. It is a peat-based growing media that contains not only peat moss but additionally perlite and vermiculite. It has been adjusted for pH with the use of limestone, and it's useful for a variety of things. This stuff is typically referred to as soilless media, strangely enough, because it doesn't have any soil in it. And it's important to always bear that in mind, because the difference between now and when we used to raise transplants 25 years ago in mixtures that contain soil is that there is very little micronutrient that is in the potting soil itself or in the soil as media that we're going to use. And so it's very important that we fertilize not only timely, but we fertilize with the proper material so that we are supplying micronutrients in addition to NP and K that's required for plant growth. Failure to fertilize these plants properly will result in very much ill-fated transplants. Okay, so now we're getting ready. We've decided what media we're going to use. We have decided what kind of container we're going to grow in. We now go back and get our trays that have our little seedlings in them. And if you look here, this is a process, and I didn't write it on the screen because I was afraid I would get in trouble, but the term for it is called pricking out. And you take a pencil and you prick out the individual seedlings. You move them over, as you see in the bottom right, to the tray where they're going to be transplanted to. You make a little dibble with your pencil and you set the plant in it. Look at this, is very important. If you look at the picture, these are two great examples. See how the little plant is being handled by the cotyledon or by the leaf? It's not being handled by the stem. I thought it was pretty funny. I didn't have to search very long. And this is some woman's blog, and she was very proud of herself and what an amazing job she was doing transplanting her marigolds, but she's actually going to kill them because if you look, she's got a hold of the stem. These young plants only have growing tips at the top and the bottom, one at the top of the root shoot, one at the bottom of the root, and if you break that growing tip off, it will be done. Okay, once we get our stuff potted out, here's a couple of pictures of growing them out in a greenhouse, and I want to show you a couple of things. The one on the left-hand side looks great. The one on the right-hand side is going to be really difficult. Look at this operation over here. We've got 3 different species located in a 4 square foot area, and we have all different kinds of sizes of plants in this one individual flat. It's going to be very difficult to water these things uniformly. So we would like to see uniform plant species laid out on the bench, and we would like them to be uniform in size. Otherwise, it's going to be difficult to keep them dry enough. Transplant growing, once we get them moved, water them only when needed. Apply fertilizer. Typically, you don't apply fertilizer the first week after you transplant, but then is then applied every week following, once a week after that. Maintain good light, maintain proper temperature and proper plant spacing. Fertilizer is going to be something like, and again, this is not an endorsement for them, but most commonly it would be something like Scott's 20-20-20. In smaller gardens, you can pick it up using a hose-on like you see in the upper right. In most large gardens, larger operations, we're going to have access to a proportional injector like the dosatron that you see here. The fertilizer solution is mixed up so that it's going to produce 200 part per million fertilizer, and that will be applied once a week. Again, delayed 1 week after transplanting, but then applied on a once-a-week basis. If you'll look, something like Peter's 20-20-20 or Scott's 20-20-20 has not only 20% N, P, and K, but in addition, it has manganese, boron, copper, iron, magnesium, molybdenum, and zinc. If you don't supply these micronutrients and you're trying to grow a 4 or 5 week transplant in soilless media, your plant is going to have nutritional problems. You really have got to pay attention to fertility when we're trying to grow these. I'm sorry, somebody asked about natural fertilizers. They're absolutely fine. Here is the one caveat to using natural fertilizers in the greenhouse. They need to be something that is somewhat already broken down so that we have some predictability about when they are going to become plant available. Some of the organic fertilizers they require time before the nutrients that they release become plant available, and in the window that we had to raise this transplant, we may not have time for those to break down. There certainly are fertilizer materials that are acceptable and they're OMRI approved, they're allowed in organic auspices, but we do need to be careful about the fertilizer material that we choose to make sure that one, not only that we're supplying the micronutrients, which is critical, but two, that those nutrients are going to be provided in a timely fashion or become plant available in a timely fashion. Light becomes difficult. When do we grow transplants? Well, typically we grow them in March and April. What is it they say about April? Oh yeah, April showers bring May flowers. We have lots of overcast weather in April, and there are some years where instead of it taking 4 weeks to raise a transplant, it may take 5 or 5.5 because we may have 1/2 of the days of the month of April be overcast, and that will change your scheduling on your plant production. The only way around that is by providing supplemental lighting, and there's very few operations that do that, but that is a way around the problem with daylight. As far as what temperature you're going to use to grow your plants, you can go online, it'll show you, but kind of typically we're looking at 75-degree days and 60-degree night temperatures for most of the transplants that you're going to wind up raising for use in market gardens in Illinois. If you'll look, here's a good transplant on the right and a poor transplant on the left. These two plants have the same number of leaves. They were planted on the same day. The one on the left was given additional water and fertilizer, and if you'll look, its internodes have stretched out. It's a more spindly plant. It is of lower quality. We are wanting short, thick, tough transplants to take to the field. It's a great example, the one on the right. Probably the number one key to that is to only water them when they really need water. Don't water them because they make you feel good. Water them because the plant needs water. Here's some other examples of what can go wrong. The upper left, you can see how purple the leaves are on the underside. You can see how the stems have no strength and they're just falling over. That's a flat that received no fertilizer during its production and it's run out of phosphorus. In the bottom right, you're seeing an example of tomato plants that were set too close together, number one. Number two, they were grown too wet. If you'll look, the plants on the edge of the flat dries out before the middle of the flat. The plants on the edge of the flat are better, although still very poor. They're better than the ones in the center of the flat, which really stays too wet. Again, I think more problems are caused in transplant production by overwatering than by any other single phenomenon, in my humble opinion. There are some tomato transplants that I raised here. They're real nice. I don't know what to say. Keys to success: good sanitation. Absolutely, if you're going to reuse clay or plastic, make sure you wash in between crop cycles with 10% bleach solution, and then make sure you rinse that bleach solution out before you actually set plants in. Secondly, maintain good light quality and light quantity. Thirdly, grow your plants underneath proper temperature regimes. And one of the neat things that we should visit about just briefly, they've done a lot of work. If you have trouble with your plants always being stretched and you feel like you're not overwatering or fertilizing, there's some neat work that was done at Michigan, and they have found that if you will keep your greenhouse cool in the first 3 hours after the sunlight comes up in the morning, plants tend to stretch much less than if it is warm during those first 3 hours. You can go online and just type Michigan transplant height control, and you'll come up with 2 or 3 articles, but it's really neat stuff, and it does tend to help. You definitely don't want your greenhouse hot first thing in the morning. That tends to lead to stretched plants, although again I think you can handle most of that stretching problem by fertilizing and watering on a correct regime. Alright, and that's it for me. I will turn off my mic and turn it over.
All right. Thanks very much, Jeff. That makes it my turn. So let's get going with my stuff. All right. So once we've followed Jeff through the journey of getting this seed into its germinated state in your propagation area, and we're looking to produce a successful transplant we're going to get out in the field, we better put that seed away. Whatever's left over from before, and the rule of thumb here is to keep the sum of the temperature in degrees Fahrenheit of your seed storage area and the percent relative humidity of that area around 80. Some moderate suggestions here are 40 to 45 degrees for your seed storage and 35 to 40% relative humidity. Too high humidity, you wouldn't want to go with 75% humidity and 5 degrees. That will freeze the seed and won't work. But if you keep it in these ranges, we expect that it will be viable in the following season. Although, as Jeff showed you, it does decline with time. So I've got about 20 minutes of stuff, and then Jeff and I will take whatever questions that you have, but try to save them till the end here and see if the rest of the presentation doesn't answer some as we go. All right. So now that we've managed the light situation, we've managed our temperature, we also need to manage disease and pests inside our propagation area. Some of the main things that we can expect to see in terms of pests are aphids. These are very small insects that reproduce very quickly. They're born with live young inside of them ready to be born. That means generation time is fast, and they can really take over if they're not managed. You can see some stippled effect usually on the top side of leaves, and look under the leaves to actually observe them either with the naked eye or with the hand lens. Thrips, these are generally viewed as a greenhouse pest, but we're sort of creating greenhouse type conditions here for propagation with warmer temperatures and trying to keep things moist. And it's that moisture that also brings slugs in. And then, of course, buying virus-resistant seed, paying attention to what's listed on your seed packet. This is the best way to keep viruses out. There's really difficult ways to deal with that once it does get into your seed, and it usually means you just need to buy new seed. So what do we do for these things? Well, aphids, they've got a little mouth part called a stylus that they jam into the seedling plant, and they suck out the sap. They can also spread viruses and disease through the stylus. Some of the suggestions for dealing with aphids are insecticidal soaps, neem oil, or your summer oils like rosemary and clove extracts, In terms of chemical control, cyfluthrin can be used, which is a synthetic pyrethroid, which should be used with caution around bees, as well as malathion, which is an organophosphate for aphid control. Thrips, you can use clove oil, insecticidal soaps, again, or malathion. Slugs, use iron phosphate products. A new one certified in organics is called Sluggo. It's been very effective. Or metal aldehyde products. All right, but the number one thing you're likely to run into is damping off. Jeff gave us a little intro here to what damping off is. It's to reiterate and then expand a bit. It's a group of soil-borne pathogens, including Rhizoctonia, Phytophthora, Botrytis, Pythium, and Sclerotinia. It affects both the seeds and the germinating seedlings, and some of the signs, which mean the physical evidence of the pathogen itself, is a white mold of fungal mycelium growing at the surface of your plug tray. And some of the symptoms, which mean things that you'll see that are a clue to a disease being there but not evidence of the disease pathogen itself are dark stem spots like in the picture here, as well as rotten stems. You can see in the middle seedling in the picture, it's been truncated, some of the roots are cut off, and the collar area is totally rotted, and then wiry stems as well. Damping off in your propagation area generally occurs in a randomized pattern that's characteristic of biological pathogens rather than across the board pattern, which you would see in something like a nutrient deficiency. So it's important to check out for these patterns. Fungal pathogens often spread in a circular pattern, beginning in one area and spreading out in a larger circle. So keeping an eye out for these changes in your propagation area can tip you off to damping off happening inside. But rather than deal with damping off, the first thing you want to do is prevent it. Prevention is so much cheaper and easier than treatment, and it's really the recommended way to go. The first thing we can do is have good sanitation. Jeff mentioned this, and this should be an A to Z thing from the beginning to the end of your transplant journey. We should be washing our plug trays from last season in a bleach solution, wearing gloves or at least washing hands before we sow, making sure that the tools we use have been cleaned, using a soilless media. Jeff covered this pretty in depth, but one point here is just that adding compost or soil can bring in pathogens and can bring in weed seeds, all of which can really disrupt this process. Providing air circulation through fans, rolling up the sides of a hoop house on days that are warm enough. These things will alter those very moist conditions where damping off, hence the name, tends to thrive. Damping off likes moist, cool conditions, so if we can get some air in there, we're helping to prevent it. And planting in a timely manner by getting these things out of there before they have a chance to really get worse, and paying attention to watering. And Jeff really hit the point home that overwatering is a major factor in poor transplant production. On the treatment side, if we do find damping off, there's a few things we can do. There's fungicides that we can spray or use as a soil drench, or you can just quarantine, rogue the areas that have damping off and discard them, but do not throw them in compost back into your soil mix. These should be gotten rid of separately, just in the trash, since they now contain soil-borne pathogens. The link at the bottom here links you to something from UMass Extension, where they go through various products that can be used to treat damping off. It's a pretty comprehensive list, and feel free to use it. All right, so now we're getting ready to actually plant these things. We've raised up a healthy transplant, we've taken care of it, and it's time to think about getting it out in the field. But before we get out in the field, we have to get it out of the plug tray, which sometimes can be easier said than done. In an ideal transplant situation, all we have to do is water them in, the morning before we're planning on planting out into the field, and hope that we can pull them out very easily with our hands. But things don't always go this way, and that's where some simple tools come in, like butter knives that you can just pop into your plug cell and use the knife in your finger to pry out the individual cells. Something like the plug pusher here on the upper left that pokes them out from the top and lays them all out in a tray where you can transplant from that tray of empty seedlings then. Or on the bottom here is a tool that has a bunch of screws put up through a board such that when you press down an appropriately sized plug tray onto the screws, it pushes them all out at once. These are just some simple tools that can help speed things up for you. But before we get to doing that, there's a few other things we have to consider. The first is that there's a significant change for plants when we move them from this warm, well-watered environment that's out of the wind in our propagation area out into a field situation where temperatures are going to be more extreme, there's going to be wind, there might be problems with animals. All of these things add up to the potential for transplant shock, which is reduced vigor, reduced growth, and the chance for death of transplants as they move from your propagation area into the field. The main thing we can do to help prevent transplant shock is to harden off plants. And this means provide them with an adjustment period. 5 days if possible. I would recommend for early season transplants a week of hardening off. And what hardening off is what you see here in the picture on the left. Moving your plug trays into an outdoor area where they have a chance to adjust to the new temperatures and new conditions. If that outdoor area were covered, that would be most preferred to ease them into the full light of a sunny day. But getting them used to it in this way will allow them to transition more easily into the field. In addition, when we're thinking about planting out into the field, we want to handle things with care, much the same as with the prickouts that Jeff mentioned. We also want to pay attention to what's happening with our transplant roots. We want to make sure that there's enough roots to hold the plug together, but not so many that it's emerging from the bottom of the cell, being root bound. Smaller plug sizes, which means more cells in a tray, means that there's the potential for fewer roots because there's less space. So for earlier transplants, those ones you're starting in late January and early February, you might want to think about going up a size and getting less into a tray, but having more space for those roots to grow for those early season transplants that are going to be out in the field by early April. Planting depth is a consideration here. Not all plants are created equal, and not all plants should be planted at the same depth. When we're talking about solanaceous crops, that is your tomatoes, peppers, and eggplants most popularly, these can all be planted rather deep into the soil and transplanted deeply. They have the capacity to produce adventitious roots off the stem, and this is to say that however deeply you plant them, that amount of stem that's in the soil can produce roots that will secure that plant and keep it stable as it grows and as it supports some heavier fruits above ground. On the flip side, things like lettuce and chicories, if you're planting endive, escarole, or radicchio, should be planted at the top of the soil surface to have as much air circulation as possible. All of these leafy plants are susceptible to bottom rot as the season goes on, and the more circulation you can provide, the better. Normal planting for most crops is just to cover the soil block or the soil plug, at the surface level and plant it from there. And of course, managing water. And as we see in the next couple of slides, there's a few different ways to do that. All right. So we're getting ready now to finally carry these piles of transplants out into the field. And here in the photo, contrary to what Jeff was saying, it looks like some people are transplanting corn. But there's some considerations here too. The timing. What's our forecast looking like? We'd like it to rain shortly after if we don't have irrigation set up. We'd like it to be warm enough that these things are going to survive. And we'd like to select the healthiest transplants. Not all of the plants in a plug tray are going to end up looking the same, and planting out the ones that are stout and seem like they can survive, not necessarily the tallest, as Jeff showed us that some leggy plants are actually less well equipped to survive, but the healthiest ones. And that means overplanting or oversowing, so that we're sowing 15 to 25% more seeds into the plug trays than we're planning on planting out into the field. We also want to think about irrigation, whether you're using drip irrigation, overhead irrigation, if you're delivering water with a water wheel transplanter at transplanting, and then of course consider your root to soil contact. If you're transplanting by hand, you'll be doing this by pressing the transplants into the hole you've made And by doing that and patting it down right around that seedling, you're breaking up the capillary action that pulls water up and evaporating from the surface of the soil and allowing it to stay in and contact the soil and water fully. That's right around the soil plug in the ground now. All right, so let's talk about getting these things in your field. There's two major ways to do this for small growers. We're talking about hand transplanting or using a mechanical transplanter to do this. You can see here in the big photo, we are using a mechanical transplanter that has two wheels. That means we're planting 2 rows in this bed, and we've got 2 people riding it. They have some transplants up here on the top, sitting on this bench, and they've got some more right here, right at about chest level, that they can grab and put in the holes as they're created. The holes are made by these cups on the wheels that, in this case, are poking through the plastic and the soil, and then water is also delivered inside the wheel and falls out through a hole that's directly behind the cups. This one you can see it a little bit better. There's a hole up here on the orange one, and the water is moving around inside of here, and it dumps out through the hole as it moves to the bottom of the wheel. Mechanical transplanting versus hand transplanting, it really depends on what your system is, how much acreage of these vegetable crops you're planning on planting, and what your overall production plan is. There's positives and negatives for both of them. In terms of mechanical transplanting, one big positive is that with the water wheel, you can water your transplants directly while they're getting in the ground. You can also mix a water-soluble fertilizer into your water and fertigate at the same time. It's appropriate for larger plantings. It takes some time to set up the mechanical transplanter on your tractor. It requires a minimum of 2 people, at the very least, a driver and someone to ride the back and put the transplants in. And the bed has to be suitable for driving equipment over. On the other hand, hand planting, it's just the opposite. The rows can be a little bit uneven, they can be a little bit wetter, you can get in there sooner, and it's appropriate for small acreages or for consecutive plantings where you're going to be planting lettuce 8 different times over the course of the year, and you want to get just one bed of lettuce in each time, or whatever the crop happens to be. In any case, in both photos here on the right, we've got some examples of dibblers, and these are things that can help you by, just like in the mechanical transplanter, these cups on the dibbler are poking holes so you know where to put your transplants. This one is a 3-row hole punch or dibbler, and it's spaced at 12 inches. You can create one at any size, and the one up top, for example, has slides that are adjustable for different spacings. Here's a link to a really informative sheet from University of Wisconsin about creating your own PVC dibbler for a very low cost. If you're not using a dibbler, they can be really helpful. They can help you get your rows straighter. They can help set up your production a little more efficiently, and they can really benefit people who are choosing to transplant by hand. So some other considerations in field planting of our transplants are having straight rows. You need to think about what your system is. In terms of cultivation, are we going to be cultivating with hand tools and hose? Are we going to be cultivating with implements pulled behind a tractor? These all inform what our row spacing should be, what the aisle spacing should be, and planning accordingly to fit an overall system will make things much easier. In terms of spacing, you might be able to get away with hand transplants with planting an extra row in there. For example, on a 4-foot bed, you might try getting 4 rows spaced at 12 inches each for some crops. You can always consider narrowing your aisles to 6 inches on the side, and that means you'll have a foot of space to walk in between beds. In terms of planting depth, I guess I already discussed that, and I'll just move on to nutrition. Jeff made some good points about nutrition in your transplant plug trays. but now we're talking about in the field. You want to have that field pre-amended with whatever fertilizer you're using, whether it's composted manure, commercial fertilizer, that should already be in there, so your transplants have plenty of nutrition as soon as they get in. Some crops are heavy feeders, or some crops might be harvested the entire season, like a bed of kale or chard, for example. And these type of things might require future nutrition, a side dress application or a foliar application of something to keep them going. Examples of some heavy feeders that aren't sitting there all season would be broccoli, cauliflower, and basil. In addition, I've got row covers here mentioned because these plants are new in the field. They've been hardened off, but we're still in the springtime. Temperatures are still low, and they still need some protection from what's out there in terms of the elements. Row covers can provide some frost protection, maybe 2 to 5 degrees benefit overnight especially. They can also keep these tender transplants safe from flea beetles and other early season pests. But be sure to manage them closely. On a warm day where the sun comes out early without clouds, it can heat up inside the row cover, much like it can heat up inside your hoop house or propagation area, and sensitive plants can get burned under there without proper management. All right, so let's talk a little bit about planning your plantings for the season. One very important thing to consider in your planning is your frost-free period. Here in Bloomington, our frost-free period is about April 15th through October 15th. This will vary throughout Illinois based on your latitude. But what this tells us is the safe zone for various crops. We want to start by knowing how many days we can expect or how many weeks we can expect our transplant to take before it will be ready to go into the field. Of course, this is variable based on conditions, as Jeff showed, that different temperatures mean different speeds of germination. But in general, if we know what our conditions are, we can get an idea of what to look for. We want to talk about how much to plant, what's our market, how many beds of a given crop do we want, how much are we looking to harvest, how many times do we want to plant this crop, how many individual plant outs do we want to have. All of these things together come into your crop planning that should start now and is going on for the winter, that informs how much you'll sow into plug trays, how much of what you sow you'll plant out. And a couple suggestions here. This is something called Clyde's Vegetable Planner. There's lots of things like it out there, but it's a really simple tool. You set it by what your frost-free date is. The months are here across the top, and then there's a list of vegetable crops here, and you move it to your frost-free date, your last frost date, and then it makes suggestions about when to sow things for transplanting and when to transplant out into the field, given its relationship to your last frost date for a given area. You also need to think about if transplanting is right for you. There might be crops that are best direct seeded, most easily direct seeded, or maybe you just want to transplant the first planting of a given crop and then direct seed after that once temperatures are warmer and things have a better chance of getting out of the ground. It really depends on what your individual soil conditions are like and what your preferences are for how to run your own operation. Finally, just some examples here about the individual crops. You can see I've got a column for a number of weeks to sow and a number of weeks to transplant, and these are all relative to that last frost date for your area. So for my area, broccoli should be sown about 12 weeks or about 3 months before that last frost date. That means we're sowing broccoli here for first planting anyway in late January, and we're transplanting it out into the field 5 weeks before last frost date, which here again would be sometime mid-March. Some things to look out for here are all the numbers in red. Eggplants, peppers, tomatoes, basil, corn, squash, cucumbers. These are all warm season crops that are very frost sensitive and need to be planted out into the field after that last frost date. Now understand that last frost dates are averages. There's no guarantees here, but following them will give you a good chance of planting at appropriate times. For example, here you see that peppers should be planted 2 weeks after that last frost date. They're warm season crops that really can't tolerate the cold temperatures and need to avoid frost at any cost. I've got a few other resource suggestions here. The first is some free crop planning software from a gentleman who worked in the financial industry, then got into farming. He updates it occasionally. It's all free. The second one is veggiecompass.com. It's also free, created by the University of Wisconsin. There's some simple spreadsheets for record keeping of your own business throughout the season, making sure to record prices, how much labor went into a given thing, what was harvested, and how much. And finally, some spreadsheets from University of Missouri. It's a pretty comprehensive list. Give any of those things a look. I really want to stress the importance of record keeping. Understanding what you did in a given season allows you to compare. Now when you're sitting there in December, January, looking at things, see what worked well, see what didn't work well, see what crops you should plant more of, see what things weren't profitable. Yeah, you don't really know unless you keep good records. This means from the hours of labor spent on something to the costs for various implements that go into your production. The better records you can keep, the more likely you are to be profitable down the road. Send me an email. Let me know what's going on there, what sort of information you'd like to see. We've got a wealth of resources, and if we know where to pinpoint our programming, then we can make it better serve you. We as Extension are here to get information out to you as the growers, but you can help us out by telling us what you want. All right, so it looks like it was pretty helpful. I hope you guys have enjoyed listening to what we have to say. We can open it up to any questions in the chat box. Go ahead, and they'll be fielded by me and Jeff. Thanks very much.
Yeah, the first question looked like it was a question about fertilizer. How long before you start fertilizer after seeds emerge? What we would normally, what the growers I'm familiar with, the seeds are going to emerge and typically get moved up to another kind of container after about a week after emergence. We would then wait about 1 week after planting them, potting them into this larger container before fertilizing. So it's normally about 2 weeks after seedling emergence before they get their first fertilizer. Probably definitely by the 3rd week they need to have a shot of some kind of fertilizer. As far as which type of fertilizer, the most commonly used fertilizers are water-soluble fertilizers, and again, because of the fact that we're using soilless media that have very little or no, depending on the brand, micronutrients in them, we need to make sure that we're using a water-soluble fertilizer that has not just N, P, and K, but additionally has what's known as micro or trace elements, 2 words for the same thing. Again, that was your copper, boron, manganese, zinc, molybdenum, all things that become a problem on about week 4 of transplants if you fail to provide them as you're growing them out. As far as different types of fertilizers at different stages, not really so much so in transplant production. If you're going to continue to grow the plants out, for example, hydroponically, then yes, we might switch ratios of what N, P, and K balances were, but for the 4 or 5 weeks required for transplant production, most growers would simply use some balanced fertilizer that contained trace elements.
I'll jump in on the next one here then, talking about worm teas and manure teas. Yeah, these things are totally legitimate ways to get nutrition into your plants. However, there's some considerations here. As I mentioned, something like manure has the potential to bring a lot of plant pathogens, weed seeds, into your transplant area, so you need to consider that. But these are legitimate, and just like Jeff mentioned, the time for nutrient release on some of these organic fertilizers is going to be longer, so you need to plan ahead a little bit. That said, so you can create your own soilless media concoction. There can be a variety of recipes to do this. You can mix your own peat and vermiculite along with your choice of rock phosphate and worm castings and blood meal or bone meal or things that will offer some of this nutrition, and then have it there in the plugs, avoiding the need for that sprayed fertilizer 2 weeks post-emergence like Jeff just mentioned. But you do need to do some experimentation there if that's what you're going to do. Make sure that the nutrition is appropriate levels, make sure that it's released at the right times, and experimenting with some in your soil mixture that you've created and some in the traditional soilless purchased media is a good way to start.
We have to be careful on the homemade concoctions that we just need to be cognizant of the fact these seedlings are not very tolerant of a very high salt index, and so the materials can be very, very good, particularly those that are manure derived. All I was saying is on the fertilizers that you're making yourself, whether they be from compost tea or manure tea, definitely those can be effective regardless of what the fertilizer, whether it's organic or inorganic. We need to be careful that those things that are water soluble, that we have some idea of what the salt indices is on that material. Young seedlings are fairly intolerant of high salt indexes, and so if we're going to make something, we should probably check it with an EC meter to make sure that we're not going to have a problem causing salt injury, which young plants or seedlings are very susceptible to.
Jeff, there's a question here if you can recommend a source for the plug seeder that you were advocating a little bit earlier.
I don't know where the cheapest source of one is. I can tell you that you can find, even in Southern Illinois, we can find some of these seeders on Craigslist. Definitely they're on eBay. The materials can be bought used. And those tend to be more economical than buying the stuff new. Definitely Hummert's or Greenhouse Megastore are two examples of places that have great websites that would have any of the kinds of equipment that we had talked about, with the possible exception of I don't know that they would have a Blackmore needle seeder, which is kind of the Cadillac of the industry, but probably not what he's looking for.
All right, so next, Jeff, we got a question from Mike about light regimes, supplemental light in the propagation area.
And Mike, most of the growers that I'm familiar with here are typically only using any supplemental light on, for example, and I know you do some of this, those first seedling transplants that you're trying to grow, that you're maybe starting in February, that you're going to set out in your high tunnel. The days can be pretty short and the light quality pretty low, and again, we can have prolonged periods of overcast weather. We may have 3, 4, 5 days in a row, and I guess as far as what kind of lights these people are using, they're normally, most of them are probably 400-watt HID lights. There are a few growers that are using 1,000. Again, those HID lights can be bought much cheaper. A lot of times you can buy an HID light used on eBay or Craigslist for the price, and it comes with everything, the reflector, the transformer, and the bulb, everything included, for what it would cost just to buy a bulb to replace them with. So if I were going to buy them, I would probably buy them used. To give you an idea, I think you're asking maybe about spacing. I'm not sure, Mike, and we can talk on the phone about this too, but in terms of spacing, on 1,000 watters, a 1,000-watt HID light basically does an 8x8 area, one light per 8x8 foot of bench, and you're looking at probably hanging that somewhere around 36 to 48 inches.
All right, so the next question is, could you touch briefly on the best indicator for when to water or stop watering? Well, there's a number of ways, a number of indicators, I guess, you could pay attention to. But just constant management is important, looking at these things daily and seeing where they're at. As a general rule, you want to be watering such that there's sufficient water in the plug, but not so much that it's running out the bottom, indicating that it's being overwatered. If you took a handful of your watered media and put it in your hand, you'd want it so that if you squeezed it, you didn't squeeze out water, and if you touched it with your finger, if you poked it with your finger, it would still crumble apart. So it does take some close management, but feeling it, and maybe if you're just getting started, putting a tray with just the media and no plants in it, and try to sort of see how things are at, so then you can take it out, you can feel it, you can work with it. But looking at how color changes within the plugs as well, and paying attention to differences within a tray is also important. You'll find that, as Jeff mentioned, around the edges of a plug tray, the water is going to drain more quickly, and in the middle of that same tray, plants will have more moisture for more time. But paying attention that way is certainly something that can be done. Of course, in a complicated, more expensive setup, there's lots of meters that can tell you what level your water is at, but it's really about watching that. Is it coming out the bottom, and does the soil feel moist but not saturated?
Yeah, if I could add to that just real quick, a lot like you said about setting your vegetable transplants, the same thing is true about watering the greenhouse. You need to look at what, the plants are fairly dry, but it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's overcast, it's going to be dark in an hour, they're calling for rain again tomorrow. Don't go through and water everything until it's nice and wet, because now it's going to sit wet for 2 full days. You need to look at the weather forecast. If it's going to rain tomorrow and it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it's going to be dark in an hour, maybe we don't really need to water those plants tonight. Let's look at them tomorrow. If the sun pops out, then we'll go ahead and give them a drink, but we're not going to water them real good at 4 o'clock this afternoon, have them sit wet all night long. Tomorrow winds up being cloudy, overcast, and cool, and the plants sit there wet for a day and a half when they would have been fine with the water they had a day and a half ago at 4 o'clock.
Jeff's going to jump in on the EC meter range question.
To be honest with you, I need to do a little bit of homework on that for young seedlings. For example, on tomatoes, you're looking at normally running ECs in the range of somewhere around 1,000 part per million on younger plants, maybe as much as 1,500 part per million on plants that are a little bit more mature. But I suspect that seedlings are probably going to be in a lower number than that 1,000 that we use when we're starting plants off. And by that I mean established plants. I would think seedlings would be even a little less tolerant of salt indices. If you would email me, I would be happy to get back with you with a number, an EC range for those young seedlings, because I suspect it's a little bit lower than what we would normally associate with, for example, tomatoes that are 4 weeks old. We're setting in a hydroponic environment.
Okay, well that looks like all the questions that we have. Thanks everyone who's still with us. We appreciate you guys attending, and we hope that it was informative. And please do get in touch if you got further questions, if you have suggestions for future programs. But if that's all for now, then a thank you from Chris and Jeff and Kyle, and we wish you guys some happy transplanting here coming up. Thanks a lot.